We need to be finding a way of helping young people understand that they're given their body and they go through puberty and that's a natural process. And to stop that is an unnatural and an unhealthy process.
Hi, I'm Jane.
Hello, my name's Alice.
And my name's Grace.
And I'm Bex.
And we are
Insightful Sisters.
Hi, everybody. We're here tonight once again with biology and medicine. We've got Alice and Grace with us this evening. They're going to talk to us about puberty blockers and also talk to us about the Levy Review.
We have. Grace is a GP with decades of experience who has been concerned about the rise in trans-identified youth. And Alice is a GP and founder of Biology and Medicine, as well as being the spokeswoman for WRN on puberty blockers.
So can one of you just tell us a little bit about biology and medicine? We'll start there.
Yes, so Biology and Medicine, we're a group of doctors, mostly GPs and colleagues, and we set up in April last year really to fight for the right interventions for our trans-identifying patients. We don't want to see them being harmed. They get put down this road of medical intervention rather than maybe what they need is some support to get through a really difficult time in their lives.
And how did each of you get drawn into this? What was the moment where you thought, this can't be right?
Well, if I start, I've been at the same practice for the last better part of 30 years. And for the first 20 years, we probably had about 5 patients that we would call transgender. And very, very sadly, 2 of them died by suicide. In 2014, when we suddenly had 5 patients who were gender questioning in the autumn, and then 5 more in the early spring, and then 5 more in the early summer, and so on, continued to carry on exploding. My concern was that this group was a very high suicide risk, and therefore we should do what we were told by the GMC and various different educational organisations. So I did what I was told. I referred to the clinics and prescribed the treatments, and I just expected there to be a change in these individuals as they received cross hormones, but I wasn't seeing that. I was seeing an improvement in their mental health maybe for maybe 6 months, and then it deteriorated, and this happened over and over again. And so since we had such a large number, by the time it got to 2016, I'd seen this pattern over and over again, and I started to wonder if we were doing the right thing. That was my moment.
That's a hard way to find out something so drastic as that. So what about you, Alice? What was the moment when you suddenly thought, no, I'm not happy about this?
Well, I saw some young trans-identifying people who I thought the treatment didn't seem to be the right thing. They weren't really transgender or transsexual as it used to be. They were seeking something else, and it didn't really seem to fit together. It wasn't that they saw themselves as the other sex. It was more that they were voting out of their own sex. There was an anxiety or a feeling of mismatch with other people, and mostly it was students. And I didn't feel we were doing the right thing for them. I didn't think that giving a young man something to make him grow a pair of breasts was actually what we should be doing within the NHS. And I didn't think that was addressing the issues that he had. And it seemed it was only in certain groups of people. So when I was working away from Cambridge, I wasn't seeing it. And then you come back and then you're in university areas and with particularly young people, you just see a absolutely overwhelming amount of people who are going down these routes, but with no real sense of why they were doing it. Did they really know the harms that they were getting themselves into by taking cross-sex hormones? And we know that we can't change sex, but our biology is what makes us. We can't separate our brains from our bodies. It didn't make any logical sense to me. And then I started seeing all the harms of, young women who'd lost their breasts and got a deep voice, and you can't come back from that.
Do you think that there's pressure from the public, from society in general, to find instant remedies for things?
I think living with distress is very tough, and sometimes uncertainty brings a great deal of distress. And if you're struggling with gender dysphoria, you want to have it sorted. You want to get rid of that uncertainty. And therefore, traveling down the medical pathway gets rid of that uncertainty. And if you have an adolescent mind, an adolescent brain, which hasn't yet developed that executive functioning part, the prefrontal cortex, which is the last bit to develop in one's 20s, you can't grasp that a decision that you make now, maybe in your teens or late teens or early 20s, that you can't quite grasp how a decision that you make now is going to affect you long term, or that you might change your mind. And so you want to make a decision, you want to have an action taken, you want to make that decision now, and you can't imagine changing your mind. You just want to get rid of that uncertainty, which will be perceived to alleviate the distress.
But also, there was a paper that came out, published from Cambridge, about the brain stages, and that really interested me because actually there's this argument that your brain stays being adolescent until right into your 30s. It was about 32, I think, when you actually develop an adult brain. And so right the way up until then, your brain is still developing. You're still looking for excitement and danger. You're still doing stupid things. And for goodness sake, we really need our young people to be like that, to go and invent things or go off and have an adventure. The trouble is that brain state also makes you do really stupid things as well. Things that you might not do when you're older, because then you can rationalize it a bit more. I think while you still have that adolescent brain, you just can't think about how things might be in the future. We do see that people change their mind. So we really shouldn't be doing things that are irreversible. And that comes back to the gender issue. There is absolutely no way that we should be doing anything that could reduce somebody's fertility before they've even had the chance to know what fertility means.
Yeah.
Before they've been able to value it. And that's what these gender interventions are doing.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect moment to hand across to Vex. I think she wants to talk to you about puberty blockers.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. The puberty blocker trial has now been put on hold.
Yes, fantastic.
Well, I want to talk to you a bit about it because, as we know, the main argument for this trial was to gather more data and more evidence. When we last spoke, we had reflected on the findings of the CAS review and the way that there is data there about the outcomes of puberty blockers, but it's lost as people are discharged back into primary care without follow-up. How are you feeling about this? I mean, you've said yes, so I'm guessing you feel it's a good decision. Do you think that this is positive?
Well, I think it would be very sensible to get more data, but I think the crucial thing is that there is data already out there. As I understand it, there was about 9,000 children that went through the GIDS clinic at the Tavistock over the years, 2,000 of which may have received puberty blockers. Those children are out there somewhere, and I think we should be able to find that data. And I believe that Hilary Cass, in her review, attempted to get that data, but the adult clinics would not release it. As I understand it, there's been some legal statute that's gone through Parliament to allow that information to be released, but it hasn't been released. But there might be a process by which the clinics could be forced to give up the information. And I think that's the way to go. We should be looking at what's happened to those children now that they're adults before we go and anything to any more young children. And that brings us on really to, I think there's some criticisms that we have to make of what Baroness Cass is saying about the puberty blocker trial. And there seem to be three reasons, as I see it, that she's talking about. One is that children are distressed, and so blocking puberty improves their distress. The second is that if a young boy then wants to carry on in a transition, he's more likely to look like a woman when he goes, if his puberty is blocked, and then he goes on to cross-sex hormones. And I think the third reason that she said when she was speaking in the House of Lords was that children are getting these puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones anyway, so surely it's better that we provide them rather than they get them illegally. And I think there's reasons to think that each of those might not be justified reasons to prescribe, but I can see why there might be that perspective as well.
Just to add to that, so I've heard it argued there have been 15 years of children being told that puberty blockers are safe and they're reversible and they can be life-altering, life-changing in a good way. And so there's a cohort of children who profoundly believe that they can change their bodies. And there's now this cohort of very distressed children who understand that a puberty blocker trial was on the way and they might have been able to receive these treatments. And one of the difficulties, as Alice just said, was that it seems that something like 20% of these youngsters are getting treatment from nefarious clinics, including cross hormones. So they're getting puberty blockers even though those are illegal, and they're getting cross hormones. But the question is, which safeguarding officer would act on that, given the background of these have been deemed safe and effective for so many years. So it's very difficult for the legal teams to uphold the law in this area. And I've heard it argued that perhaps it is, dare I say it, the lesser of two evils for this trial to go ahead in order that there can be some solid data. The genie has been let out of the bottle 2014 when puberty blockers became very widely used. We cannot put that genie back in the bottle, but how can we contain it? How can we do this in a safe and a controlled way to get information that is desperately needed? And I agree with Alice. I think that the optimum way is to get, the information from the 2,000 people who have probably been on puberty blockers. And how one does that, Sajid Javid, I understand, as you said earlier, gave permission for that information to be released. And I don't know why the clinics aren't still doing that. If it is available, I just don't understand why we can't do that first before doing anything more to cohort of more young people. But is this puberty blocker trial the lesser of two evils? Would it give us answers that we would not necessarily have otherwise? And I don't know.
I think it begs the question, was the suggestion of the puberty blocker trial in the first place just a bit of a workaround for having to do the hard legwork of chasing up all of these cases that we've lost? Why do you think, having the understanding that you have of medical practices and I guess these people that are now under the primary care system and not under these clinics anymore, is it really going to be that difficult to track down all of these cases and see what the outcomes have been for them?
I think you would need to have GPs prepared to say who they know who's on puberty blockers, and that would require the consent of the patient. And I think if you could get things via that route, that would be an excellent way to go ahead. I just don't know quite how easy that is. Alice, your thoughts?
Yes, audits within general practice are very common. We're regularly asked to perform audits on particular disease patterns and to share that information. So I think it could be possible to collect data on people that the GPs know who are on cross-sex hormones, if they know it, because it depends whether they realise that particular person is transgender, depending on what sex they're registered as. But you could look at the people who are taking hormones in the younger age group. And then I don't think I see a problem with sharing anonymised data, because I think this is something that's quite common within the NHS. I think there are a certain group of activists who will be writing or trying to get hold of anyone who's transgender and telling them not to share or to refuse their data to be shared. And that's clearly is a great shame, and it might need further legal processes to make sure that the data is collected. But I think it should be able to be. I think with my cynical hat on, thought is that the only way that Hilary Cass could stop puberty blockers being used as a routine procedure within the NHS was to say that there would be a trial. I think most of us believed that the data linkage study that we're talking about, that when you go and find the data in the older from the adult clinics, I think we all thought that would go ahead first and that a puberty blocker trial would only happen later. But my sense is that the people, trans rights groups, are very invested in making sure that young people can still get the blockers. And I suspect that's why it's been pushed ahead.
And so in terms of now, the pause that's been put in place, what do you see as the rationale behind that? have you been surprised by the stance that, different people have taken by CAS and by various politicians?
I've been very surprised by Hilary Cass's response. As I say, there was the reasons she's given that she thought that the puberty blocker trial should go ahead, and she's also been talking about that children being used as a political football, and that there's groups of people who are campaigning on both sides. I feel very much that I'm doing my utmost to try and protect my patients from the harms that I see. It's very hard to be told by somebody who is a paediatrician that trying to get in the way of something that's the best for these children. And actually, just before we started to talk, I was looking at the judicial review case and the way that just seems to be so many flaws. And I think a lot of us were thinking, how on earth can this trial go ahead? Because there are so many problems with it. And it just seemed very unlikely that you were going to be able to get any genuine information out of it that would tell you anything, such that I don't think that Hilary Cass would have been able to use this particular study in her Cass review, should it have been there at the time. So I don't think that it makes any sense at all to go ahead with it. In fact, just from a logical, ethical point of view, the only reason to go onto a puberty blocker is if you genuinely think that the sex of your puberty is a choice. If you think that sex is a choice, then puberty blockers make a bit of sense. But puberty isn't a choice, and you don't have a choice of which puberty to go through because the hormones don't work properly with the other sex's body and brain.
I think my question remains, if we cannot get that information from the 2,000 that have gone through the Tavistock, what do we do to put this to bed once and for all? Because we really do need to be finding a way of helping young people understand that they're given their body and they go through puberty and that's a natural process. And to stop that is an unnatural and an unhealthy process. But how are we going to do that without the data? And if we can't get the data through the 2,000 people, how are we going to do that? And people have said, not this puberty blocker trial. If we're going to do a puberty blocker trial, not this one. Structure it differently so that it's not ending after 2 years, but much, much longer. And I absolutely agree with that. But I've heard others say that at one level we're sort of assuming this is a little bit like the Tavistock early intervention trial, and that the children will be perhaps not as carefully selected and then will go on to cross hormones. But I understand from individuals involved with the trial that the children are very, 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 very carefully selected, much more so than had happened before, and that the tightness of the observation of the children as they go through the trial will be very close, and they'll be looking at IQ and bone density and body mass index and a whole host of other things. And there's still been this argument that would it not be better to have something that's controlled than the uncontrolled situation that we're having at the moment. So I'm finding myself feeling in the horns of a bit of a dilemma. I mean, I can't stand the thought of anyone going on puberty blockers, but I can't stand the thought of this sort of going on for another 30 years. And I would like a definitive answer and some kind of definitive study that shows us something clearly. Alice,
yes. So I was listening to Hannah Barnes talking on a podcast, actually. Just today, I was listening to what she was saying. And with her experience from her investigation into JIDS, and also she was talking about the Dutch protocol, she was very clear that it wasn't possible to find out which children would benefit and which would not. And the Dutch protocol, particularly the study there, there was a lot of children that were lost to follow-up. And it seemed as though data that they were using and publishing was manipulated into a way that made it look as though people were much happier. But actually, when you broke it down and looked at what they'd done, the evidence wasn't there that they had benefited anyone. And the other thing with the Dutch studies, is that a child died.
Yeah.
So I just was so worried about the harms. And then if you go back to what the other things you were saying about the IQ and the bone density are going to be looked at very carefully. Even if you find the right little boys, the right little girls, they're going to lose IQ. They're going to lose bone density, and also the possibility for a kind of genital reconstruction for boys becomes less possible. So you can't, all these reasons means it's just not possible to stop them at a time when it's safe to stop them going through puberty. And, children that don't go through puberty do not develop sexually, so they won't get a normal adult sexuality. And they're not fertile. And there's this thing about sort of referring people for fertility preserving procedures. But it doesn't work until the children have gone through puberty. You cannot collect sperm, you cannot collect the eggs until puberty has proceeded, because you don't have the development of those things until then. So I cannot see how the puberty blockers can be justified in any way, even if you get the right children, even if you think you can get the right children. It's a huge price to be paid. And then I think if you don't have the possibility of puberty blockers, I was talking with a psychologist the other day. She said, if the choice isn't there, then it makes it much easier for us as psychologists then to go and help that child to think about other ways, think through this problem in another way. And it's much easier then to work with a child who doesn't have the possibility of a medical fix and can go down the talking therapy fix instead.
My longing is to get hold of all those youngsters that have been through and been on puberty blockers. And the thing I want them all to have on an annual basis is a mental health review, because those that I have encountered are troubled souls. And so I feel very, very turbulent about all of this. I feel dreadful. I feel dreadful.
We all want the best for our
Yeah.
patients, don't we?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a real struggle to know what is the right thing for that individual in front of you. But when we talked the other day, Grace, you had 3 really nice outcomes or ways of thinking whether it was working for them.
I'd love to see people to be asked about, how they're functioning in society. So you look at whether they're able to hold down a job that is sort of matches their educational level. So holding down a job, secure in a family network, stable in a family network, and content in themselves. Those were the 3 things that I find myself looking at when I look at someone's sort of holistic functioning. I've found that a useful tool.
And for those people who who have been through some kind of transition, do you have any sense of whether they may be, whether you think they're doing okay?
Oh dear, troubled souls. I'm so sorry. I feel my heart aches for them. And but the prospect of youngsters getting puberty blockers off the internet, what do we do about that? What can we do to stop that happening?
I mean, it is an interesting one, isn't it? I think what's interesting about this puberty blocker trial suggestion was the government, in a way, if they do go ahead, are really sticking their neck above the parapet, because they then may become directly responsible for the fallout if there are bad side effects in the long run. And obviously we often compare this to thalidomide. And it's true, I could see the fallout of this continuing to rumble on over decades. If you could grab a politician by the shoulders who has no understanding about, medicine, and just impart a piece of knowledge to them that you think that they need to know when they're weighing up this puberty blocker trial, what would you really want them to understand? What do you think they really need to know?
It doesn't work. You can't change sex.
I'd be going along the consent. How can a child grasp the enormity of never being able to have children? That is assuming that these youngsters go on to puberty blockers and then cross hormones. That may not be the case, but if they do, there is no prospect of children.
So much of what you've been talking about means that we need more evidence. And yet you've also alluded to the fact that there is more evidence there, and we haven't always been given it. So I want to talk to you about the Levy Review. So can you tell us a little about the Levy Review, why it was commissioned and what its findings were?
Well, it came out of the CAS review, really. There'd been a look at the children's services, but it hadn't been possible to have a good look at the adult services, even though Cass had wanted to do that. So Dr. Levy, who's a cancer specialist and has been a medical director, was tasked with having a look at this area. And it was very clear that there were problems because there was an incredibly long waiting list to be seen, and people were getting very distressed on it. So there were clearly problems. But we wanted to know, were they safe? Were they effective? And how did the clinics compare? When he started to think there was something like 7 clinics, there are now 9. He looked at 9 clinics, and he spent a long time gathering information. He went to visit the clinics. He did surveys with patients, with family members, with staff. He gathered information from questionnaires before visiting the clinics. Had presentations when he was out there. He went and had looked around, talked to the staff. And he also looked at any data that had been collected, as was supposed to have happened, by the clinics. And it was interesting that he discovered that there was quite a lot of difference between the clinics in terms of how they worked, how they assessed patients, who assessed the patients, how long they were assessed for. But most notably, it was the data that had been collected that was part of the remit of each clinic, and they were supposed to have done audits, and none of that had happened. So they didn't know about the prevalence of gender dysphoria in society. They didn't know the complexity of the individuals. They couldn't say what proportion they had mental health or neurodiversity or difficult social backgrounds. None of that data had been collected. They couldn't say about detransitions that none of that data had been collected. There hadn't been any collection on the impact of the interventions, and there hadn't been any collection on patient long-term outcomes. So the very things that we most wanted to know hadn't been gathered. Lots of other things had been, like waiting times. At the moment, it looks at the moment as if it's going to be a 15-year wait to be seen in a clinic as things stand at the moment, and there are about 40,000 people on the waiting list. But there's a problem with that data because some people have been referred to more than one clinic. So we don't know quite how many people are really on the list. There's a lot of duplication. But it's raised lots of questions. But the other thing that was interesting that came out of Levy Review was his desire to streamline the assessment process, and in order to get people through the clinics more quickly. And my concern is that this is happening without any clear outcome data. And it's a bit like flying a plane and building it at the same time. We're doing something that's really quite uncertain, incredibly uncertain, without knowing whether it's a safe thing to do.
I mean, I think for those of us who are gender critical, we read this report, it's in 2 halves really for us, because the findings are really damning, aren't they? And as we expected, no data. I think he calls it limited and inconsistent. It's the data. As you said, the patient practice is really all over the place. People seen from a variety of different appointment times and frequency. It's really, really damning. But it's the recommendations. What about your thoughts on it, Alice? What did you think when you read it? Presumably you were waiting with some anticipation, hoping that it would do what you wanted it to do.
Yes, well, I think we were all very much hoping that David Levy would have a similar approach to Hilary Cass in how she looked very deeply at the underlying problems with the children's service. But actually, he appears to have had a look at the service specifications and just sort of matched up whether the clinics were performing to the service specs. And the trouble is, the service specs were written along the lines of WPATH, which we've talked about before, which is a discredited international organisation of a bunch of people who want to push gender affirmation, and they call themselves professional. So these guidelines were broadly drawn up by the people who also run the gender clinics, and it's really pushing for there to be more services, more easily accessible, pushing more work to the GPs to prescribe, and please prescribe sooner rather than later, rather than any kind of idea that you should wait and see. And in fact, there's a letter that Hilary Cass wrote to the commissioners. That's John Stewart's the National Director at NHS England. This was a letter in May 2024, So it was written to him and also to Professor James Palmer, who's the Specialist Commissioning National Medical Director. And she outlines some of the absolutely appalling things that are happening within the adult service. For example, she says, clinicians spoke to me and they felt that in common with the population that is presenting to children and young people services, the majority of patient presentations are extremely complex, with a mixture of trauma, abuse, mental health diagnoses, forensic history, autism, ADHD, and the assessment was inadequate. And then she also says it was difficult for clinicians to defend a decision not to prescribe hormones, except in exceptional cases. So this is a letter that she was writing saying, this is all wrong. We shouldn't just be prescribing hormones to people who are distressed. But actually, the recommendations that Levy has isn't to stop all this happening, which you would think was the logical conclusion of how awful the clinics are. His recommendations are to do more and faster and to have, as you say, to streamline the process so that you get more young people through the service quicker. But there's one thing that's really illuminating within the report. There's a table of how many people of each age group that are coming through. And when we were looking at this the other day, we noticed that the number of years in each age group is very different. So you start off with, I think it's a 17 to 19-year-old. So it's just 3 years. And there's lots of them. And then the next age group is about 5 years, 20 to 24. And then after that, it's 10 years. So there's a huge spike in the very young people, the late teens. And then it rapidly falls away, but it doesn't look as though it falls away quite so rapidly because of the way the age bands work. And so when you look at that and you realise what's happening, you realise that there's this huge amount of really very young people. And as we said before, their brains they are adolescent still. They're very impetuous and it's very easy to push them down this route if they get sucked into a belief system. And if you just make them wait for a little bit, you're going to mean that you protect that really vulnerable age group from the extremes of the harms. Actually, I think it's a really good thing that there's a 15-year wait because hopefully fewer people can be harmed. But what we really need is to get all these young people and to say, hang on a minute, let's really think about this and let's help you to understand yourself a little bit more, just to get to the point where just in a few years' time, maybe it's not quite so important. But if you do it now, it's forever.
Absolutely agree with you.
It's very interesting when you said he was a cancer specialist, because some of the things in his review, if you substituted cancer for gender medicine, I think he'd be horrified to read that you were suggesting that this is dealt with by primary care and you should speed up with unfounded research and so on.
Yes, actually, again, one of the big points here is that there's no proper education. There's no way of becoming an expert in gender medicine because the courses aren't there.
Yeah. So we touched earlier when you were talking about puberty blockers, we talked about the distress that young people go through often. In talking about Levy, we're really talking about what we'd probably call vulnerable adults. We throw this term about, vulnerable adult. What is a vulnerable adult in your mind?
The vulnerable adults that I would see would be ones that are struggling with mental health issues and or have come from a turbulent family background. It could be disease, death, divorce, something like that within the family. People for whom neurodiversity is often a big component of their makeup. These are young people for whom they're a little bit more vulnerable to suggestion and to find a way out of the distress that they're experiencing. Some of them have been abused in various different ways. And at the tip of the iceberg is the gender dysphoria. We have a responsibility as doctors to look properly, see what is driving the distress of gender dysphoria and to address that before giving medical treatment. We need to address the mental health. We need to address the fact that there may be neurodiverse and not fitting in. These are the young people that I see very commonly. Alice?
Yes, there's something about fitting in, isn't there? There's something about finding your tribe. And I think the tribe becomes quite powerful, doesn't it? And it's sort of, oh, come along with us, and yes, you're trans, and come and join the club. And it's very powerful. It's a way of belonging, especially if you've come away to university or for the first time, and you find somewhere to fit in. The other factor that we haven't talked about is people who are gay or lesbian, the same-sex attracted young people. And I think in the GIDS clinic, most of them, the huge majority, and I can't remember the figure now, they were same-sex attracted, and some of the whistleblowers they were laughing about it. Well, there were some jokes around in the clinic about transing away the gay. I mean, that is desperate. That is really cruel. Where else does that? We think about Iran, who makes their gay young men become trans identifying because otherwise they'd kill them. We should not be doing something that a repressive regime is doing to people who are same-sex attracted.
So awful. It's unimaginable what we're doing to people long term.
Actually, I found the Levy Review recommendations quite difficult to read because it's pushing a lot of the responsibility, it's trying to push a lot of the responsibility down towards the GP. It wants more local services, more community prescribers and people to review them every year. And it's trying to encourage GPs with an extended role to take on these people. And what I can see in this is that there's some pilots that have been set up with a specialist GP who will take on these people, and I can just see that the local commissioning might ask a specialist GP to see them and assess them and start prescribing. Really worries me because I do not think this is the right thing for this group, because quite a lot of them, if you just give them a few more years, will be okay. And then you think about the regret rates, and people say, oh, the regret rate is only about 2%. But that doesn't take into account all the people who just stop turning up for their hormones and are lost to follow-up. And there's some papers that show that regret might take as long as 8 years, maybe somewhere between 7 and 10 years. And so we haven't, we just don't have the numbers yet. But wait for 7 or 10 years, and we're going to have an absolute avalanche of these people who are going to need some kind of support to come to terms with what's happened to them and what they've done to themselves and what the medical profession has done to them.
Which is why it's so important for us to do our jobs properly, look underneath the bonnet and see what's driving the distress. It's essential.
Rather than to continue the car metaphor, putting petrol into a diesel car, which you're doing effectively with the wrong sex hormones, aren't you?
Yes, as I said earlier, switching hormones doesn't work.
So when you read Levy, what were you hoping to find at the end? Should the recommendations have been?
Well, I would like a thorough review of the adult services. I'd like hormones to be stopped. Well, I think actually, I just think the clinics need to close. I don't think there's any logic to having this at all. There used to be a very small number of people in middle-aged, mostly men, who would go through some kind of sex reassignment treatments, as it used to be known, the kind of transsexual procedures. But this huge number of young people, we are not serving well with these clinics, and certainly not by the sort of more and faster approach. So, I mean, really, I'd like it all to stop. But realistically, I think a really good review of the clinics, including having a look at the data that they have, in a similar way as Hilary Cass reviewed the children's service, we need to have a really good look at the adult one and to see what the long-term outcomes are.
GPs have a significant role here because given that the GMC says that if we are prescribing unlicensed medication, if we are satisfied that there's enough evidence or experience to show that it is safe and effective, then we can go ahead and prescribe that. We just simply don't have that information. And therefore, I think we're treading on very, very thin ice if we're prescribing these treatments. I think it's unwise. I've stopped prescribing, but we'll see what happens amongst my colleagues.
That actually brings me back to biology and medicine, because we've published some information for GPs on our Substack. Things like we've got letters for the gender clinics, letters for patients to say we're not prescribing anymore. We've also got a blog up to say that we believe that GPs do not have to refer at all to gender clinics because we know that the gender clinics will in effect harm our patients, and so we shouldn't be referring in the first place. I would hope that some of that information gets out to other people and some of the GPs might start fighting back a bit more. I know that in some places this is happening. And Grace is absolutely right. If we stop prescribing, then the clinics have to do it themselves. And that's going to reduce the availability of people to see new patients. So maybe we can limit the harm that way.
There are some places where there's been a decision across the practice not to prescribe, and there are many others who aren't aware that there's a choice and feel obliged to prescribe because there's pressure from the GMC and pressure from the Royal College of GPs to do what the gender clinics advise.
We talked about retrieval of evidence that's already there and how you could anonymise and so on and retrieve it. Does the government have any legal powers? I've been a bit shocked actually over the last few years by how little notice health authorities and so on take what the Minister for Health will say. Does the government have any power to just tell health authorities and GPs to release data?
That's one strength of the Levy Report. It was, this has got to happen and it's got to be done meticulously and diligently and quarterly. As you signed up as a specialist service, you have absolutely got to do this. And one of the things that he said was that this lack of data was increasing the disadvantage of this cohort of people and that it perpetuated the inequality facing people that are gender questioning. And it really wasn't acceptable given that we must be improving the services for them. So it was absolutely shocking.
Yes, well, when Baroness Cass was doing her review, I think she tried to get the information from the gender clinics, but they refused. People like Derek Glidden who does the East of England service, refused to hand over the information. I think my sense is that if the data had been positive for the service, then they would have handed it over straight away. But we must draw the conclusion that the evidence is damning, otherwise we'd know about it. So I think that the clinics are holding on to it as long as they possibly can because it's so awful. And then I also think that as Grace is saying, the data might be incredibly patchy and difficult to use to generate anything useful. But I think that brings us coming back to the GPs who will hold data. And again, I think there may have to be some kind of legal statutes, whatever, to put through to enable that data to be collected. But I think it's really, really important that it is. And it will be tricky to think about patient confidentiality. But on the other hand, it's really important we know how these people are getting on because we don't want to harm them. We don't want to harm them. We don't want to harm future people.
We could talk about this forever, and it's a fascinating subject.
Grace and I spent, I think it was 4 hours the other day, just chatting through all this.
I'm sure, yeah. We could. There's so many things that you've mentioned in passing. When you talked about male and female brain, I thought, I'd like to do a whole episode on male and female brain. We could talk about it forever, but we have to think people will be listening to this and on their walk or on their run or while they're cooking. So I'm going to leave the Levy Report and move to our final question. We always ask the same question because we like to throw the love forward a little. We only interview women and we like you to promote other women too. So a woman or women of the moment.
Shall I say, well, actually, controversially, perhaps not. It's actually Hilary Cass because my life's been changed by the report that she's done and the fact that it's possible to have a discussion on this in a measured way is largely due to her. And I am very grateful. There are things that I disagree with inevitably, but I am so deeply grateful to her. And so she's going to be the one I'm going to use.
But I think you're right in that she was the person who did the first major review in the world, as far as I understand it. And she said, hang on, this isn't right. I think, so her report that, I mean, as you say, not everything was perfect, was it? But her report really was the first. And I think other places around the world have been able to look at their services because she has produced it. So, and I'm actually quite disappointed with Cass just now with some of the things she said and both sides in this argument and so on. But anyway, that notwithstanding, she was the first person. So I'm going to go, I was thinking, who should I go for? And last time I talked about sort of the local people, particularly who'd been supporting me so that I was able to speak out. I'm very, very grateful for so many, it seems to be Scottish women who have been fantastic in this fight. And I'm going to name drop Margaret McCartney, who's a GP in Glasgow, who's been talking about this for many, many years. So she was the person who said stage at the Battle of Ideas in London about 18 months ago, we need more doctors talking out about this. And so I thought, I'm going to have to do something. And then the other person I'm going to name drop, I'm sorry, I did this last time, lots of names. The other person is somebody who I don't think gets enough recognition on Twitter. And she's anonymous and she goes by Rebecca Says No. And she publishes lots of stuff about the appalling things that goes on within the NHS around around gender and sex. And I think more of her stuff needs to be read. And I think she's got so many names and so many receipts there about all the people who've led us down this dreadful route.
Well, you're certainly right. It is a dreadful route. We seem to have got ourselves into such a muddle, but thanks to people like yourselves, I think we will get out of it. We will improve things. I think things are improving. There's some light at the end of the tunnel.
God, that was a really interesting episode. Thank you both. Thank you to our listeners. We really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff to help keep our channel growing and spread the word. Thank you.